Honourable Leader of the Greens.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, this is without question the most consequential and sweeping powers legislation that Parliament has debated. It's a huge piece of legislation which will have very significant impact on the lives of many Tasmanians. And of course its intent, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to save lives, to keep people safe and well, to make sure that there are powers there to ease financial hardships on individual Tasmanians and businesses, but also to ensure that, if you like, the ship of state, the regulatory and statutory framework can go on. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, obviously we received a briefing on this legislation before we'd seen it yesterday, and do thank the Office of Parliamentary Counsel for what I hear was a very frank and entertaining briefing, and have done our best to understand this legislation, but it does hand to government on trust enormous powers. Madam Deputy Speaker, it gives to the Premier, the Treasurer and the Attorney-General in some ways sweeping powers, and I know there are constraints in here that relate to the issuing of notices only specific to deal with the Covid-19 response. Nonetheless, I share concerns that have been raised about a potential lack of scrutiny in relation to the way those powers are exercised, Madam Speaker, and we've got a number of questions that we want to ask the Premier on the way through. But I thought I'd just share with the House, before I went into the detail of the bill, an email I just received before lunchtime from a doctor at the Royal who, I must qualify, is not my son, who is working in the emergency department at the Royal, and for whom, of course, as a mother, I worry. This doctor says, "Dear Ms O'Connor, I'm a resident working at the Royal Hobart Hospital. Over the last week, we've seen a truly alarming uptick in the rate of COVID-19 diagnoses in Tasmania. At the time of writing, our state sits at 36 confirmed cases. Earlier news reports of cases tout, quote, no community spread, end quote. But unless we enact a hard lockdown in our state, it's sadly inevitable. There are strong suspicions that we already have community spread, but our testing criteria is not wide enough to capture it for the time being. Unfortunately, not enough is currently being done at a federal level to mitigate the spread of COVID. This is the time for states and territories to act independently and save thousands of lives." This is no exaggeration. Current modelling of COVID spread and mortality paints a very bleak picture, and inaction at a federal level is costing us dearly. Congratulations, and I'm sure this doctor meant to the entire Parliament, on acting decisively early in the piece and enacting restrictions on our borders. This was an excellent move and no doubt bought our state more time. However, this will be for naught if we do not capitalise on this action and enforce lockdown in our state. You and I both know the Royal Hobart Hospital is not equipped for the wave of COVID-19 patients that we'll see if we continue our current trajectory. We already operate at capacity more often than not without a pandemic. Our ICU and ventilator capacity will soon be overwhelmed with unprecedented loss of life. I urge you to consider a hard lockdown on our state. Every hour counts. A shutdown for the next few weeks will pay dividends in the months to come. Ultimately, history will judge our leaders harshly on this tumultuous time. Please make the right choice. Lives are at stake like never before. I look forward to your response. If you do not want to deem a shutdown necessary, I'd appreciate justification. And I gather that this resident medical officer at the Royal, whose name I will keep confidential, has written in similar terms to other members. Madam Speaker.
Leader of the Greens.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before the break, I was reading into the Hansard a plea from a doctor at the Royal Hobart Hospital, who I made it clear is not related to me in any way, who is asking for strong lockdown measures to be put in place, and we know that that is certainly being considered as part of an effective response to preventing transmission of the virus. So what I might do now, Premier, is just go through some of the specific questions in the legislation with the qualifier that, and this is particularly for the talented people who drafted this bill, that it is really difficult in the space of 2 hours to wrap your head around in a way that we would all be satisfied with the provisions in this legislation. So I may not see relationships between different clauses that explain some of the concerns that we wanted to raise. So, under Part 2, circumstances in which notices may be issued, our understanding was that, and this came from the briefing yesterday, we had formed the view on the information that we had that the emergency manager needed to be satisfied that a notice was necessary. But now, as I read this, if you connect clauses 5 and 6, clause 6, emergency manager to approve making of notices, and it details that a notice under this Act, other than A, notice under Section 20 that relates to the court other than the Court of Petty Sessions or the Magistrates Court, or B, a notice under Section 22 or 23, or C, a notice under Section 27, may only be issued with the approval of the emergency manager. And this slightly turns around the onus of responsibility in a way, because what we've got now is ministers determining that a notice is necessary and the emergency manager approving that notice. So the way I read this is that it's not the emergency manager telling a minister that a notice is necessary. It is a minister simply seeking approval from the emergency manager for the notice. So, Premier, if you could explain why that change has been made, that would be helpful, because it's these sorts of provisions that can make responsible legislators uneasy about potential abuses of power. Scrutiny of notices, clause 7. Now, these are the provisions which seek to provide a measure of transparency and accountability about the issuing of notices by the Premier, Treasurer or Attorney General that relate to tenancies, fees and charges, and the cessation of the emergency declaration, or the public health emergency declaration, and this is the provision that requires the minister to table a copy of the notice before each House of Parliament, and makes it clear that it's to go to the subordinate legislation committee. If we could have a really clear explanation of how that works, that would work in practice when Parliament is not sitting, that would be extremely helpful and useful. Okay, so clause 8, when the notice takes effect and the duration of the notice does this mean so the notice takes effect on the day it is published in the Gazette, or if it's later, if it's in the notice from later that day, is subclause 3, 8.3, a notice under this Act is taken to be revoked 60 days after the emergency cessation day, and of course the emergency cessation day has some it raises some questions. So in clause 27, the emergency cessation day seems, Madam Speaker, to be somewhat open-ended potentially. So what we know is that in clause 27, the Director of Public Health must notify the Minister as soon as reasonably practicable after he or she is of the opinion that the relevant emergency circumstances referred to in section 5.2 no longer exist to such an extent that a notice under Part 4, other than a notice amending or revoking such a notice, may be required to be issued under this Act so as to assist in the reduction of the risk of infection by the disease. 2, the Minister by notice, within 90 days after a notice is issued to the Minister, under subsection 1, must declare a day specified in the notice to be the emergency cessation day. Now, Madam Speaker, I think that that leaves it open for a Minister of the Crown, the Minister, potentially to wait for, so say the Director of Public Health notifies the Minister on the 30th of September this year. Now, I appreciate that's unlikely, 30th of September this year. Under this provision, the Minister has 90 days, so the Minister could wait till the 1st of January to issue a notice declaring a specific day to be the emergency cessation day. I'm maybe missing something, but to me it reads that the Minister could declare, for example, if the Minister was staggering drunk on power, that the emergency cessation day could be 10 years hence. So it's really open-ended and concerning, and I think there need to be some sort of hard dates or temporal provisions in there that make sure the Minister can't just take over the government, if you like, and shut down democracy in Tasmania. So if the Premier could deal with that specifically, because we are quite concerned about that. In clause 11, we have the Minister by notice may amend or revoke a notice other than a notice revoking another notice that the Minister may issue under this Act. And then there is nothing in that particular clause, clause 11, that makes it clear any amendment or revocation of a notice is published in the Gazette, tabled in Parliament or sent to sub-ledge. And again, my qualifier here is I haven't had enough time to really, no one in this building has, to really, or on this side of the House, to really pull all the threads of the clauses together to see how they connect. But can the Minister, the Premier, please deal with clause 11 and whether or not any amendment or revocation of a notice is subject to the same transparency provisions as the issuing of a notice itself. So clause 14, and I know Ms White dealt with this in some detail, but clause 14 relates to the amendment of planning and other permits and potentially does give the Minister some very, very significant powers. And these are the powers so the Minister may take a specific action. Oh, so this is the statutory timelines. Hang on a second. Clause 15. Just hang on a minute. Sorry, I'll just go to my clause notes. Yep. So in clause 14, the Minister is empowered to make a notice or amend or revoke a permit or class of permits, including planning permits and other permits as prescribed by regulation. I'm sure the Premier would agree this does give the Minister very, very significant powers, and to remember that this Act also allows for the delegation of the issuing of notices and some powers under this Act. Could we just have some really clear reassurance from the Premier that changes to planning provisions or permits would be very narrowly and specifically applied only to the COVID-19 emergency response.
I'm very happy to give you that assurance.
Thank you. In Part 3, Clause 17, this is the authorisation to take actions electronically, and it provides the Minister with the power to make a notice to allow actions ordinarily required to be undertaken physically or evidence via non-electronic means to be undertaken electronically. And obviously this is a necessary amendment in order for public services and public administration and our important democratic institutions to continue to function in this time of crisis. I'm interested in the Premier's thoughts on how we could, and I know Parliament operates within its own time and dimensions, but that there must be a capacity at some level for us to continue to conduct a Parliament in form.
My understanding is that under a ministerial direction, utilising that clause, that we could hold a Parliament under those circumstances.
Yeah, that would be...
If we needed to. I'm hoping we don't.
Oh, well, I'm hoping we don't too, but also I'm hoping we don't do what the federal Parliament did, which is to adjourn until the 11th of August. I don't think that's good public administration, and we have had conversations about the importance of keeping our democratic institutions going with all those safeguards in place. So having a very, very extended parliamentary break, I think, well, it would certainly concern us, but I think it would worry the community more broadly. If they thought that we weren't on the job, if you like, and if they thought, which many do now as a result of the decision of the federal Parliament, or the federal government in Parliament, if they thought that Parliament was going to cease until August and members of Parliament and senators will just go off to their hometowns and sit on the couch and watch Netflix on the public purse. And I understand why everyday people would be resentful of that, given how many people have lost their jobs and their businesses, and a measure of hope for the future this year at least. So the financial hardship provisions in Section 5, Part 5, sorry, these relate to commercial tenancies, to restricting rent increases or the termination of commercial tenancies. Now, I wandered over to the ghost town that is Salamanca to buy something for lunch today, and was chatting to one of the local business owners there who was, well, he was remarkably kind of relaxed. Sanguine is a good word for it. But he did talk about the rents, that he's got two businesses, one's at Salamanca, one's at Moona, and over the next 6 months his rental bill alone is $270,000. And this is a business operator who spent 35 years building up his business. It's a very successful, it's a terrific business. And that's just one story of a commercial operator, a business operator, facing the kind of unpayable rents that they will be facing. So we do support this part. And it's really clear. The Minister may by notice declare that despite any provision of a lease, other than a lease to which the Residential Tenancy Act of 1997 applies, a lease that's within a class of leases specified in the notice must not, within the emergency period, be terminated, and the rent payable under the lease may not be increased in the circumstances set out in the notice. So my question to the Premier is, they're excellent provisions in order to try to put as many businesses as possible into hibernation and shepherd them through the dark times. I don't see those same protections for residential tenancies, and I know there are some. But I think that these measures provide substantially more tangible support to business owners than they do to residential tenants. And we are dealing with a situation where, as we all know, tens of thousands of Tasmanians have lost their jobs. There are people now already rigid with fear about how they're going to pay their rent in the private rental market, and yet there's no, as far as I can see, firm mechanism in this legislation to ensure you're putting a freeze on rent increases for residential tenants in the same way that you are for business operators. Because it's really clear, this provision, the rent may not be increased for commercial tenancies, and yet the rent could be increased for residential tenancies. There's no specific provision in here for there to be a freeze on rent increases for people in the private rental market, and they will be needed. They will be needed. I already asked the question about the emergency cessation day, and we don't want to go into committee for a range of reasons, and we're hoping that the Minister will answer the concern that we have about open-endedness around an emergency cessation day. On the consequential amendments, it's a very big step to remove, during this emergency period, protections under the Personal Information Protection Act, Madam Speaker. And we accept that in order to save lives and in order for different jurisdictions to be able to communicate with each other about potentially about people who are potentially carrying the disease and not complying with orders, there will need to be some flexibility around the protection of personal information. But this power must be used very carefully because the Parliament enacted a Personal Information Protection Act for good reason, and that is to protect to the greatest extent possible the privacy of citizens who come into contact with the arms of government. So if the Premier could provide some reassurances about how narrowly the term for it is how narrowly the lifting of the application of the Personal Information Protection Act in these circumstances will be applied. And then in the schedule, the consequential amendments that relate to the Residential Tenancy Act are really, we think, quite limited in a way, because what it does is it makes it's positive in that it will prevent the eviction of a tenant on the basis that they can't pay their rent, but it doesn't do anything to ensure rents aren't unreasonably increased. These changes, of course, also make sure real estate agents and staff are not exposed to potential risk by having to undertake personal inspections in place, Madam Speaker, and that's a positive. But we are quite concerned that for private tenants there's much more bureaucratic effort, if you like, required. You have to go to the Residential Tenancy Commissioner if you want to have a lease terminated or if you think a rent increase has been unreasonable, and of course that's a capacity that the Residential Tenancy Commissioner already has, but there's nothing in there that will stop serious rent increases in a time of emergency when many people will not be able to pay their rent. And that's a hard and sorry fact, Madam Speaker. So I am about to sit down, but just in closing, there are jurisdictions which have gone much harder on social protections in response to the coronavirus. The West Australian government has just declared that they're going to put a freeze on electricity bills, utility bills and the like. And in France, Macron has made assurances that there'll be strong protections in place, including rent holidays and the like, in order to keep people housed. And it's interesting, Madam Speaker, in London, for example, a city which a number of us will have been to, where homelessness is right in your face, right there, on every street corner, homeless people. Well, not anymore in London, not anymore, because a choice has been made to provide safe accommodation for people who are homeless. And it tells us something about the dark side of the capitalist system, that until there is a widespread public health risk and until it's possible that rich people might contract the virus, we've been leaving homeless people in London on the streets. It is possible to solve homelessness overnight, Madam Speaker. These are choices we make as a society. It's amazing how swiftly governments can respond to issues like chronic homelessness when there's an existential threat on the doorstep. So we are going to see huge pressure here, huge social pressure. People are going to be at increased risk of homelessness because they can't pay their rent, and we need to have strong measures in place to ensure we are keeping people safe inside their homes. And for people who are living on the streets now, and we know they still are on the streets now, here in Hobart, Madam Speaker, we need to have a strong, coordinated, protective response to those people. We also need to understand that the prison system is a place of high risk transmission, that there are prisoners, inmates in our correctional facilities who have multiple chronic health conditions, and there are inmates in the system who are low risk. Now, we've written to the Attorney-General asking her to follow the lead of other jurisdictions, including New South Wales, and that is to release low-risk prisoners back to their homes in the community, and therefore put more protections in place for inmates who remain and for correctional staff. Madam Speaker, these are unprecedented times, and we can't be treating people in a classist way. People are people, and there are family members of detainees in our corrections system in Tasmania who are highly stressed about the risk to the people that they love. And let's remember, some of those inmates will be in there for quite minor offences and are not a community risk, Madam Speaker. So we do strongly encourage the government to listen to what Dr Woodruff is saying on our behalf, but also to advocates for prisoners, including lawyer Greg Barnes. So we recognise, Madam Speaker, that this bill is going to be the last opportunity for Parliament to get it right in a legislative sense, that it hands very significant powers to ministers, and we're doing this on trust. And we're doing this because we've committed to working together, and we're doing it out of love of this island and its people. This is a very significant piece of legislation. It is potentially open to abuse. I'm trusting you, Premier, not to abuse the powers that this parliament will be vesting in you this day. And I'm sure that the upper house will also pass the legislation, of course, and we hope that they do. But this is a huge trust ask, and I ask you to respect that. Thanks, Madam